All right, chapter 2 of your textbook. This is the chemistry chapter, a very exciting chapter and a chapter of great foundation learning in terms of terms, didn't mean to say it that way, um, uh, with knowing what basic words mean and using them as you go forward into studying systems. For example, it's very difficult to really grasp what a cell is if you don't understand, and what a cell does if you don't understand the chemistry, because really chemistry is what your body is all about. It's just a series of chemical reactions that are going on. We put all of those chemical reactions together and understand them as urine production, and understand them as blood pressure regulation, understand them as digestion. So this foundation in chemistry is very, very important for your knowledge going forward. Chemistry, all matter is made up of atoms. Atoms have the ability to join together to form larger particles. Those larger particles are either going to be molecules or compounds. Molecules if they are the same types of elements, compounds if they're different types of elements. And elements are somewhat, the word element is somewhat synonymous with atom. However, when we speak of an element in our mindset, we're thinking of a specific element. And when we think of a specific element as opposed to an atom, which is a generic term, but when we think of a specific element like oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, we are ascribing in our brain certain properties to that element. Hydrogen reacts different than oxygen. Hydrogen is a different molecular mass than oxygen, has different makeup, protons and neutrons, than oxygen. And so element is somewhat synonymous with the word atom, but not quite. Kind of like calling you a student or calling you by your name. So when I call you by your name, you're still a student, but you're very specifically that particular student. Subatomic particles, you have protons. Those are positively charged, found in the nucleus of the atom. They have 1 unit mass. Neutrons are neutral charge, have a unit mass. Electrons have a negative charge, balance out that positive charge of the proton, and have low mass. Low to no mass. When I first started learning chemistry, they always said no mass, and that actually has moved along to understand that they do have some mass, but just negligible. This is a nice image, one of many images you have in your book. One of the ways that I would suggest studying A&P is to find which path works for you. You want to listen to the lectures, you want to read the outlines that I've put onto the class page, and then look at the images, and anything that just strikes you as, boy, I don't get that at all, read the chapter in that. It's wonderful. If you love this book and you want to read through the book, that's a great thing to do. Don't get me wrong, but some people get bogged down in the book and get lost in the book. So maybe listen to the lectures, read the outline, or read the outline and then listen to the lectures, and then go into the textbook maybe third, depending on how you study. We can talk more about it individually if you want some tips on how to approach this material. Atomic number is the number of protons, and that atomic number of protons is what identifies that atom as a specific element. And in the nucleus you find, and the nucleus is, just like we think of a nucleus, is more or less the center of the atom or the element. You have the protons and neutrons, and then the electron is going to orbit around the nucleus in what's known as a cloud. The reason we call that a cloud is it's constantly moving very quickly, and it looks like a blur of movement, which creates that cloud appearance. With regard to this image, what they're doing here is telling you, defining what an isotope is. And an isotope is going to have the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons. And so the isotope will have, this is hydrogen, has 1 proton. Second, hydrogen 2, which heavy hydrogen has 1 neutron. Hydrogen 3 has 2 neutrons. So its mass, its atomic mass, is going to change. Its atomic number is going to stay the same. It's still an hydrogen atom, hydrogen element. It just happens to be an isotope of hydrogen because it has those extra neutrons, extra mass. Still has very similar properties of the original element, but slightly different properties because of those extra neutrons. We consider the atomic mass of hydrogen as the average of all the isotopes that can be created or are possible or have been discovered, I guess you might say. A little bit more about elements, although we've kind of covered this already. Elements are determined by the atomic number. Atomic number, again, number of protons, and they are the most basic. You can't get more, I guess more, you can't take anything away from an element and still have it be that element. So we can't take the proton away from the hydrogen and have it still be a prohydrogen. We can't take the electron away and still have it be a hydrogen. The weight is the mass of all particles, so in essence the protons and neutrons, and then a little bit of that electron, but very low mass. And it's measured in moles. It's the term they use. The average, and then with the mass is the average of all the isotopes. Remember, isotopes are those extra neutrons which deliver mass but no charge. And then here you have this concept of the electron cloud. And with the electron cloud, and these electron clouds can get up to 8 energy shells, which you have in carbon, which carbon plays a big part in the human body. And with those, you have the electrons traveling in very predictable cycles, which we call energy levels or energy shells. And each of those energy shells will orbit around the nucleus. The electrons in the energy shells fill closest to the nucleus first. And then as those energy shells closest to the nucleus get filled, then they fill on out to the energy valence, the energy shell that's furthest away from the nucleus, and we call that the electron valence shell. And that is the shell that shell that's furthest from the nucleus is the one that's reactive, is the one where those electrons are bonded to the particular nucleus of that element, but can also be drawn away to the nucleus of another element, because the nucleus of another element is going to have a positive charge also. And so that idea, get that in your head, that idea of these electron valence shells and their reactivity in terms of the outermost valence shell, because that's the concept that makes you understand what bonding is, how chemicals can bond together, and when they bond together they create a compound or a molecule that acts different than the original element. Bonds can be, speaking of bonds, bonds can be ionic, covalent, or weak hydrogen bonding. It's just a property of hydrogen, a very important property of hydrogen, particularly in the formation of proteins, the protein structure, the tertiary protein structure. But the ionic bonds, what happens there is you have maybe a element with a very highly charged nucleus getting together with an element with not so highly charged comparatively nucleus, and what happens is one of the electrons of the weaker charge is going to be donated or given to the other element. They're still going to stay together as a compound, but the electron is going to be shared unequally, not equally. And what we have with this ionic bonds, we have this what's considered an electron donor. So the smaller, weaker nucleus is going to donate to the larger, and we consider that smaller, weaker a cation. And the acceptor, the larger, more charged particle or element, as the anion or the electron acceptor. Covalent bonds basically equal sharing, mostly equal sharing of the electrons. An electron will go around one and then the other, kind of a figure 8. And hydrogen, you have a attraction that is not equal. And what happens, we think of water, what happens is you have a polarity to the compound then. So it's not ionic because there's other properties with regard to ionic bonding. They dissociate in water. So water, being a polar molecule, doesn't dissociate in itself, but there is a charge to it where you have a more positive pole and a negative pole, and that's very important. It's very important in terms of this polarity for many of the properties that the cell does, many of the metabolic activities the cell does, and even the properties of how individual cells organize themselves in relationship to that polarity of water. We have in epithelial cells particularly, you have a basal surface and then you have an apical surface. So you have a surface to that cell, and that's in relationship to water. Molecules and compounds, we kind of covered this already. Molecules are two elements of the same type. Compounds, different elements. And when they're the same type, they're equal in positive nucleus, so there can be strong bonds. Different types, it can vary. You can have strong bonds or weak bonds. So in compounds, you can have strong or weak. All compounds are molecules, but not all molecules are compounds. Maybe a bit more than you need to know. Just understand that those two words are not interchangeable, molecules and compounds. So H2 is a molecule, H2O is a compound. And what you have here is a nice stopping point with regard to just resting your brain and looking at this image and seeing what the difference between an ionic bond is. And sodium chloride is the one that we tend to use very often because we relate to it. It's salt, sodium chloride. It dissolves in water, dissociates in water, and that disassociating. So you see the salt as a solid, put it into water, stir it up, it goes away, we don't see it, but when we taste it, we taste the salt. So you have the ions, the cation and anion, disassociating, coming apart in water. The bond is being pulled apart in water, or made, depending on whether you are putting it into the water or boiling the water off. Covalent bonds, these can have a variety of types. You can have single, double, and triple. So you share the elements share one electron. That would be a single covalent. Can share 2 electrons, double, or 3. And it tends to be, I guess, and you know, here's the first time I admit I'm not a solid specific chemist, but the triple covalent bonds tend to be less stable than the double single covalent bonds. Single covalent bonds, pretty stable covalent bonds. So these can be the case. They do vary a little bit in their ability to be reactive. And then here you have molecules, examples of molecules, and again a brain vacation just to look at an image and kind of get that image together with what you're thinking. And these would be examples of molecules and compounds, and certainly molecules and compounds that you might be very familiar with. As I said before, covalent bonds can be polar or nonpolar, and nonpolar ones you have equal sharing. So the electrons are shared equally by the elements that are involved in that bonding. Polar, unequal sharing, and that the most common example of a polar covalent bond is water. And you have an image of water here. I always think it looks like a little Mickey Mouse where you have the superscript written, the blue hydrogen ions